Well, welcome everybody. We are absolutely thrilled to be here with this panel. I don't know if we've had more fun talking before the event or here. We have a short, sharp, and 35 minutes that we're going to get on with things. So the first good news is this is a panel that really does not require introduction. Many of you know everybody that I have here seated to my left, and so we're thrilled to be doing this. The second thing I would say is that this is going to be future focused. All of us were at these conferences, and this one in particular from the very beginning. At that time, if we were saying what were the issues that would have been really forward-focusing, we're in the middle of those now. So what you're going to get from this panel is what are those issues going to be in the next 3 to 5 years that we're going to be really looking at. So with that, let me make a couple of just quick introductions, and then we're going to start with each panelist giving a couple of minutes about what they're passionate about, or what they're doing right now. We'll open up for some questions. The good news is there's a break right after this panel, so you can feel free to come and get all of your questions answered at that point in time. To my left is Karen Kerrigan, the COO of Cedars, and to her left is Claire Calmajane, and Claire is the Chief Innovation Officer at SocGen. To her left is Catherine Wines. Catherine is the co-founder of World Remit. To her left is Kashala Somasundram, and she is the global head of FinTech partnerships and strategies for HSBC. And finally, we have Seema Johnson, who is the co-founder and COO of Nuggets. So with that, we're going to start off where I started in FinTech and financial services, and that's with the bankers. So again, Kashala, could you start with a couple of minutes on how you're seeing the industry right now?
Thank you. As we said before, I guess we are looking at more futuristic thing because we've been talking about fintech now nearly probably about 6-7 years. There's been a lot of hype around it. I'll give you a little bit of background in terms of how the journey started within HSBC itself to put things in context before I move forward. So back in sort of the 2013, 2014 time frame, we set up a team called Group Innovation with 3 pillars in mind, broadly speaking, strategy, incubation, and investments. And on the back of that, we did a number of investments, including the likes of TradeShare, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and Symphony, Platfora, and to name a few. And then when it came to sort of the 2016 era, we were starting to see another shift. The shift was actually very much, historically, it was trying to consolidate the efforts across innovation within the multiple jurisdictions and multiple product lines, regional, et cetera. But in terms of the 2016 shift came along where there were a lot of banks who were talking about digital transformation as a thing. And you would find that a number of banks who were historically investing into digital banks, the likes of BBVA, Intersimple, and the likes, more and more banks were starting to build their own SME proposition in terms of digital banking. Open banking came along. I can see some experts in the room here. So with that in mind, HSBC also set up a corporate institutional digital team, and then I set up a team called FinTech Partnership. And so what is the idea behind that? The notion behind that is because we are such a large bank with about 70 countries that we are present in, we've got I think probably roughly about a quarter of our workforce is actually in technology. So with that in mind, we said, okay, how do we connect the dots between these various product lines, regions, and countries, and people more importantly? So this one is very much like a traditional portfolio management role within, if you want to call it a VC construct. And then on the back of that, we've set up partnerships. So one of the partnerships I'd love to talk to you a bit more about is, again, TradeShift. It came on the back of a trade finance proposition, and then what we've seen is that it morphed into other areas, the likes of payments and cash management, where there's tens of billions of dollars of flow where we can actually use our payment proposition to help some of our consumers get sort of a speedy proposition. Then the other one is around foreign exchange as well. How do we plug in our flex rate into the platform, to name a few. And then what we are seeing now is in terms of going forward, I think that we are moving into the next era or phase where I think, different people probably have different views on it. My view is that there's been a lot of talk about sustainability and impact. So for me, I'm, again, very passionate about the impact financing piece. I think there is a huge amount that is going for it. But fundamentally, you still need the infrastructure for that. And infrastructure, by that I mean the likes of, for example, how do we get like identity, for example? There's, I think probably Charlotte spoke about it earlier in terms of financial inclusion. Before we can even talk about impact financial inclusion, we need to have a framework, the likes of making sure that people have a self-sovereign identity. People know you. Do we know who we are? Banking, and how do we actually access a broader community of people? So that's one, and I don't want to sort of monopolize this one, but the second part of it also that I'm really, really passionate about, and I think it's got a lot of value going for it, is around the how do you make historically what used to be an uninvestable asset class. So it only was in the hands of certain asset classes, which were only in the hands of a fair few of the construct, but how do we make it more accessible to a broader community? Again, in the class of, for example, trade finance, there are lending propositions that we do that has historically been not accessible to a broader community, whether if it's hedge funds or, more importantly, even to the retail customers. So that's another one that I think is something to watch out for. Again, data then becomes such an important part of it, because you need to make sure that anything that you're able to build as a secondary market, you're able to have the right set of data to be able to do it in the right construct.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Claire.
So we've been talking a little bit about, how do we create this ecosystem together? How did we work together about that? And for me, I've seen, at the beginning there was a competition, then we went to the collaboration, then the regulator participated more and more. We had the sandbox in the UK, and the UK is still leading this ecosystem for Europe with, really fast leading forward activities, such as recently the fact that we published a framework for banks and startups to work together that really helps the different departments. I think now today, and you've just heard Rishi, the reality is FinTech now is taking the stage. These companies, they are really big, they're really competitors, they are partners, but they are more than that, they are suppliers. So, they are considered for me like the GAFA, and honestly, where before we were all about open innovation and how do we open our organization, and in Société Générale we have about 7 open innovation centers across the world. We have, for each of our 17 business units, one of the leaders of innovation that is directly allocated to the CEO, and my role has been directly created near Frédéric Oudéa, our CEO, to look after how do we move forward in this journey together. For me, it's not anymore something that is on the side, and this is really what I look forward in the next 3 years. I think we are reaching a point, and what are going to be our challenges to really tackle it? I work in an organization that is present in 61 countries, that have about 161,000 people, and they all dream about this innovation. They all want to be there. They all want to make this deal with you. They consider that now technology, the penny have landed, technology is the next generation of the clients. But how do we do that? In a world that is very fragmented in Europe from a regulation point of view, in a world where we all want to be global, but like each of our work is really challenging. And for me, one of the main points will be how regulators work together, how FinTech can be global in Europe. And when I talk with some of you, that are CEOs of FinTech, I know one of the preoccupations is how do I expand? Because you are generally in conquest for customers, and the reality is it's very hard to do it in a domestic market, so your only chance is to go abroad and expand that. And here is my call for a lot of people in this room that work in industry body. How do you do it not only in the UK, but how do you work with the different entities in Europe? Because our challenge today, and that's probably the second one, is the rise of the Asian hub. We've talked a lot about that last year in this forum, but it's coming. They are coming. They are very big fintechs in Asia. We've all talked about Lufax, about all of them, and their critical mass is going to change some of the way financial services is working. And we can see some of the emerging, we've talked about the hype of blockchain a lot, but the reality is the dematerialization of money. Some of the trends that are coming are starting to materialize in these geographies, and they will probably shape the next 10 to 15 years in financial services. And the reality is for Europe to be strong, we really have to be together in this party. And obviously it's very hard, and we all know that with the political context. And the third point is really about how do we keep innovating for the clients. And maybe some of the other panelists will be much more on top to talk about that, even if, I consider we have an app that is very well rated in France. But how do we keep this innovation for the consumer? In the UK, you've implemented open banking, and obviously, in my role, I look globally. I look also in Africa, in Russia, in Asia, about what's going on in these ecosystems. And there is a lot to do. And we are just at the beginning of this journey. We are just at the beginning of how this is going to transform. So for me, we need to keep pushing. We need to keep working together to make that happen.
Great. And one of the leading innovations, I think, in FinTech was payments. So, Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I said quite a few points have been mentioned, but I just wanted to kind of go on through my, yeah, definitely, kind of when we started, well, 9 years ago, it was to simplify payment. And payments were, one of the things which was expensive, slow, and there was, especially in terms of the international money transfer, so that was, solving that problem. But I've seen also how the technology has helped us to resolve that problem even better and make the product more frictionless. And I think that's what is important, is to see as we can improve all the time, because although we did something which I thought was great, there's a lot more to be done in terms of making that product even more frictionless. And certainly the new technology in terms of AI or machine learning or the KYC kind of providers. And that's where the collaboration, I think, has come as well. It's not only that the technology has moved, it's that also we've collaborated. So people kind of work together rather than trying to invent the wheel, everybody trying to invent the wheel. So I think that has been quite important for us. For me, and at where we meet, and certainly in our field, I think mobile technology has been, tremendous in terms of changing the way people do things and helping them in terms of, day to day. We work a lot in Africa and in other, emerging economies, and mobile money has been, what I call a revolution in terms of allowing people to use even a simple mobile, not just a smartphone, to be able to send money to each other and then access to other financial services. We talked about financial inclusion, and I think that's very important. And it's not just in emerging economies. There's a financial inclusion problem in this country and in a lot of developed countries. And again, the technology is there to help them. So that's to me, is quite important. I just want to touch a point on regulation, because obviously as a business who is regulated in many, many countries, is still a pain in the neck in terms of, I believe in regulation, but we are quite lucky in the UK. I think, we have a very progressive regulator who has been, set up the sandbox. But, I've worked, we have got licenses in a lot of countries, and it's a very difficult process. It's different. The sandbox, which I was a very big proponent when it was launched, I have to say, having experienced it in other countries, I'm not so kind of as excited about it, because they are, it's not a solution for everything. And I think that's why I would call, regulators, and I know there's a kind of work being done on that, but, a unified regulation, a much more kind of unified approach is really needed to really help this problem to be solved. Because if, if you go to a country and it's a totally completely the legislation or approach, as a business to scale up, first it's very difficult, but also you are not resolving the problem of, what you're trying to do. I think one also kind of a change as well, and I think something which is kind of happening a lot is FinTech for good. I think we have not mentioned that, and I'm certainly a big proponent. I'm an advisor of a kind of a small business started the crowdfunding for helping homeless back into work. I'll just put beam.org, have a look at the website. But, there are so many businesses which actually, as a business, we can actually resolve real problem and do it quite well through technology. And it doesn't have to be always the public sector to do it. It can be done through, a collaboration with the public sector and the private sector to resolve those problems. So I think there's a lot of things there.
Great, thank you. Karen, you have at Cedars really worked at democratizing assets of investment that weren't available before, so I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, I was really keen for speaking to Deanna before this panel that this isn't just about banking. You know, we're talking about innovation in financial services. And I think what we have done at Cedars in terms of equity crowdfunding has really opened up an asset class that wasn't available to a different type of investor through technology. So we enable all types of businesses to raise venture finance through our platform in a really straightforward fashion, and equally enable investors to create a diversified portfolio at the hit of a button. We were the first platform that was regulated by the FCA back in 2012, and since then we've raised 580 million through the platform and funded over 790 deals. You know, and it's quite interesting me being here today, because this isn't just about Cedars as a fintech, but we're also an investor in fintech. You know, it's one of our best performing sectors. Funded the likes of Revolut, of Dozens, WeSwap, Risk. I know lots of people from those businesses are here today, so that's been fascinating for us. We're not doing pure equity crowdfunding in the same way as I spoke at this conference 5 years ago when it first started off. This isn't just raising money for businesses and investing. This is about developing the whole infrastructure around equity investment. And we see a world in the years to come, not in the too distant future, where everybody has a current account and they also have a Cedars investment in their portfolio. And that world is not too far away. At Cedars, we really view innovation in two key facets. The first is regulation. As I said, we've been close to the regulatory development in this space since 2012. I sit on the board of the UK Crowdfunding Association, and we've had a really healthy relationship with the regulator and provided and worked to develop a structure that both enables innovation, but also proportionately addresses the risks. So we're really big supporters of that. But the biggest opportunity for us is operational scalability at the moment. We have taken an offline activity and made that accessible through technology. And you know, we've just started looking at where we can improve those margins in every different sense. And you think, wow, take Revolut, for example, that raised 3.4 million from 4,300 investors, some of whom were investing £10 in a matter of hours. And we're doing that on multiple businesses every day. What we're looking at the moment in terms of innovation is developing things like machine learning enabled technology that will help us spot the pitches that are more likely to succeed, spot those campaigns, enabling us to securitize, for example, our carry, and we take an investment carry in each of our portfolio investments, and a huge amount of opportunity at each stage of that offline activity. So really excited about the future. Amazing to see how much, you know, we as a business have developed in the last 5 years since I was last speaking on this stage. And I think that goes for other fintechs in the space as well.
Thanks so much. Sina, it's interesting because when we talked a little bit before, you were talking about the fact that you were inspired with this idea from outside fintech. So you brought Skype and Microsoft experience into addressing the issue that, again, Nugget works on.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about Nuggets first, and then I'll talk a little bit just around addressing some of the technological advances. So Nuggets came about from us having our credit cards used fraudulently online. We realised that my credit card was stored across 80 online locations where it had been cloned, and I had no idea really which website, and these were all very reputable websites. And about 5 years ago, we thought about, should we develop almost like a personal payment token where we could give a public key access to other providers. So that's where Nuggets was born. We are an e-commerce payments and sovereign identity platform that allows you to store your personal and your payment information securely in the blockchain, so you don't have to share it or store it with anyone when you log in or carry out an e-commerce payment or verify your identity with a call center. So that's essentially where Nuggets came from, and we absolutely believe that personal information should be owned and controlled by the person. And that really takes me on to my next few points, I suppose, with 5G, AI, IoT, blockchain, all these, amazing technologies that are set to, promising to change the way we transact with technology, we also need to ensure that there is a privacy framework and data protection protocols that are comprehensive and interoperable globally to safeguard identity and payment as we move into these emerging technologies. Privacy is a fundamental human right, and we're now starting to see large groups of consumers that are just not prepared to give up their privacy, safety in exchange for convenience. And I find it crazy now that we put our credit card details into e-commerce sites, or we speak to our fraud departments at our banks and we have to verify our identity before they're prepared to identify themselves. So I think what we're going to start to see now, and Kashala, you touched on this just now around self-sovereign identity, but that merging and that real comprehensive merging with payments. So that's where I see the real opportunity now.
Absolutely, and just to pick up on that point for the rest of the panelists, this idea of, I've been in financial services for decades, and it always was the payments happened over here, or any of the financial activity, the retail happened over here. Now you're seeing really this emergence, as you just referred to, of everything and all that goes along with it, including the payments, the purchase, the identity, the privacy, everything along the way. How can we see that really developing? And if you're sitting in our audience today, what are some of the things that they should be focusing on in that space, both from somebody providing a company, an idea, that next generation of getting the great companies going, but also who's sitting in a major institution, either retail, financial services, something else? What do we need to be focusing on in that area?
Yeah, so I think there's the real, we need to think about things being agnostic and not just being owned by, one bank or one retailer or one partner. From my perspective, a digital identity, a verified digital identity should be interoperable wherever you are, and that's where the real power comes in. So I think a lot more collaboration and thinking more on an ecosystem level, as opposed to, let me just sort this out for, sorry, this is cutting in and out. Let me just think about my telco or my e-commerce site. I think it needs to be something that is interoperable across. So I think that definitely is something we need to look at.
I think fintechs themselves are actually much more predisposed to take advantage of that network effect and the use of other different fintechs. And I look at the stuff that we're doing internally, and some of that is innovation from in-house. So we've developed products like our secondary market, our auto invest feature, our EIS 100 fund, which are innovations that are key to what we do. But we're also very open to using other types of innovation, for example, in the KYC and payment space. There's been already talk about digital banking and PSD2 this morning. We're very, very actively looking at opportunities to scale those finance operations by integrating with those kinds of platforms. So in terms of your question of what could other organizations be doing better, I think it's learning that mentality and being willing to, in the sense of big corporates, shorten that sales cycle, take risks, even if it is piloting different parts of the business, because there are fintechs, regtechs, legal techs even, being able to serve different parts of your business in a much more efficient way.
I think that there is 2 points. There is to your point, when you work in a big corporate, there is a question of the ownership of the customer, and there is a question of the business model of your payment business. And when you look at the ownership of the customer, the journey and where do we need to focus is about, how do we bring, all the stuff in this journey about the fact that it's the decision of the customer, how they use it, where they use it. And that's why, we have a very strong open banking strategy. But for example, if you look in France in our retail banks, they have opened a structure called Paylib, which is like a Zelle, the equivalent of Zelle or Venmo in the US. And it's early days. And, they are wondering, when we started to have Google Pay in some of our brands, like our online brand, Boursorama. But for our more traditional brands, they were like, okay, but how should I look at Paylib and Google Pay and etc. They were not thinking from scratch about the open system, and they were still sitting into the fence of how much do I need to go open and how much do I need to connect to all the payment ecosystem and to give up somehow what I have built and what I have invested on, because it's the sense of the story and it's where the customer is going versus I'm producing very good tools and I want to retain my ecosystem. And sometimes if you go, in some country like Africa, we've launched our mobile wallet, which is called Yep, and here it's even different, is there is no ecosystem. There is no really payment forward leading, like we have in the UK. So it's a different mentality. So the first point is the ownership of the customer, and that you have to look with indicators, with culture change, with opening the eyes, with meeting the GAFAs, meeting the FinTech and say, look, this is where it's going. And the second part is about the business model, because when we talk about a lot of the payment business model now, the new ones have a different revenue pool. And this is what is challenging, it's the problem is not the Kodak moment, because it's payments obviously and the transactions are very different. But for me, it was very interesting to look that Zelle have operated about 39 billion of transactions just in Q1. I remember when Zelle was set up, and it was not so long away, and they managed to have 33 banks that got together, operate a full API system and open banking system, and they've done it. And now in Q1, it's 39 billion. But this takes the time for me to look at what wants to be your business model, and surely when you operate this level of transaction, you're not anymore in a peer-to-peer transaction. You've passed this point and you've started to put, probably their SME. I don't know them in detail, but I will guess that for this number, they've already put their SME and probably start looking at some of their corporate change. And this provides of new technology, new tools that are enabling them to change, working collaboratively, which is what you were mentioning.
Great. Charlotte, I want to pick up on one of the challenges that I've found, whether your business is small or your business is global, as HSBC's is. And it seems that we're at a moment right now where the technology is developing more rapidly than a lot of our colleagues and people able to embrace it and to use it and to change the way they work. I had an interesting panel that I convened a couple of weeks ago, and the head of all of education for the 21st century was there on it from Microsoft. And I said, so what's your, what's your job? And she said, well, my job's to upskill humanity. And I think on that topic, I'd like to take it kind of to the people side. So you've had a lot of experience in this with big and small organizations. Can you start on that topic?
I guess, excuse me. I think for me, I look at the world in a very simplistic way. I think I see technology as always an enabler of something that we are actually trying to solve for. So whether if it is a problem definition, if it's growing the market share, whatever it might be. So I look at it simplistically from a three-lens perspective. The first one is about how do we actually increase or enhance our wallet. So a number of my colleagues have talked about, growing the market share, growing the revenue pool, et cetera, or getting customer access. And within that, two of the technologies I feel that enable that is, one is the data that I spoke about. So how do we actually use the existing data or potentially even alternative data to actually make a meaningful form of revenue pool? The second part of it is actually getting a much better customer experience, which plays back to your original question around, how do you actually, so all of the digital banking efforts and everything else that's going on is placed to two of these trends. The second part of it is, I would say, is really around getting efficiency gains. So, which is where the people side of it sort of starts to come into play. But it is really about reskilling. But really, that's where we have seen most of the emerging new technologies play to their strength in terms of really, truly extracting efficiency gains. So whether we talk about blockchain, the work that we're doing with R3, or any of the work that we're doing with the AI companies, cloud is helping as well. All of that is helping us to draw efficiency gains, but there is going to, but more importantly, a people impact perspective, but we have to really start thinking about reskilling and getting them to a place where they're going to be more value-adding as opposed to just doing the historic, traditional process of management, sort of, on digitized processes. The third part of it is really around the compliance piece. And that is almost inevitable, right? So a lot of the things, the news feeds that we've been getting more recently of the companies that are going at an astronomical phase in terms of client acquisition and growth, quite often perhaps may not think about the full impact of what it's like to run a scale business from a compliance perspective. And we are all in it together, and therefore there are things like cybersecurity, things like how do you do biometrics, how do you do KYC, all of that becomes such a critical part of it. And so when I look at the, again, phase of evolution, banks historically, at least for the last sort of maybe 2-3 years, and including ourselves, we've been focused very much about efficiency gains and extracting cost challenge. The second part of, I think, what we are seeing now is really very much about, what is the must-have? Why do we have to absolutely invest in? To actually make sure that our systems, our processes, and our people, and everybody, in the ecosystem are protected in the right construct. But overarching all of that is that, again, to your point earlier, we are not seeing financial services as a standalone business. We've got colleagues from Deloitte, for example, here, and they will tell you, there is so much convergence that's happening in the industry, and we're going to continue to see that, which is, again, a very exciting place to be. But if you keep with the sort of almost the pillars into this sort of simple three, formats, you would see whether if you're working in an energy sector, whether you're working in telecom sector, whether in financial services. Broadly speaking, these are the three sort of pillars. And then underlying all of that is the people impact and how do you make a better construct of it. There will inevitably be new roles that are going to be forming as a result as well. We are not going to see the traditional forms of, head of commercialization perhaps. There is going to be a new norm. And that I think is a very exciting place to be.
That's great. Switching a little bit, and I'm picking up on a comment, Catherine, that you talked about, and it is the FinTech for good, and it leads into the issue of when all tech really started off, and it was small and evolving. It was, this is the good new people coming up. Now we have tech that's getting big. There's ethics questions that are being evolved. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see ethics fitting into kind of the whole realm of what we're doing, whether we are a FinTech or an established organization or whatever, but where is ethics going over the next 3 years?
Well, I think, and certainly when you hear some of the thing in the news, and I won't mention them, I think ethics is quite important. And I think, as a business, especially at Wrapup, we put compliance and ethics, that's very much at the top of our business when we started, and has been very important. We talk about digital identity, we talk about, preserving data. If you don't have ethics, that's not going to work. So, as a business, we've got to have, we've got to think about ethics, and we've got to be at the heart of the business. Otherwise, we say one thing, but we do another thing. So I think, to me, it's very important. I don't know, I hate to add more regulation, but certainly I think there's been too many people thinking, I set up a FinTech and make millions without really thinking what they were actually doing. But I think it's about really thinking what we are trying to solve. And even investors are changing. One of our investors is what we call a social impact investor. And they're really seeing, this is not philanthropy. This is about, looking at resolving a problem and solving a problem and investing in it where you can actually make a good return. So that, I think, is all part of the same thing.
It's something that I've been thinking about on actually a personal level a lot recently. We are designing algorithms, we're creating machine learning technologies that is actually going to be making decisions on behalf of people that are looking to raise funds or looking to invest. So the people that design that infrastructure, that design that technology, behind every piece of technology, every automated decision, there are real people. And I think probably 2 minutes before the end of the panel isn't the time to start getting into the diversity and ethics and big subjects like that. But I am definitely thinking a lot as COO at Cedars about what our internal makeup looks like and the people that are designing those systems that ultimately will determine how people raise money and how people fundraise. So yeah, probably a bit too late in the panel to get into.
It's our next panel.
Yeah, I think that's where the importance also to be very close to the customer and really understanding what the customer wants and not just add things just for the sake of it. And I think there's been a lot of business. Sometimes I've just added features just to cover because it looks nice. I think the team, the engineering team, whether it is product or the whole organization, is really looking at the customer and seeing what exactly is actually useful to them.
I was just going to add to that, actually, because I think historically when we look at investment dollars, we look at it predominantly from two things. One is it of strategic relevance? And that way it doesn't have to be a company that is going to provide you an end-to-end solution. It can even be a niche proposition. The second of all, again, is really the return on investment, which a lot of us have talked about. There is clearly a movement, actually, that is adding the third layer onto it, which is about purpose. when we actually do an investment decision and when we think about it, it could be a very strategically important client or, investment for us, but, does it have purpose?
Absolutely. Well, we are gathering to the end of our appointed time. I knew this would go way too fast for everyone. But just as a wrap-up question, I think what I'm interested in is, are there any areas that you are seeing now? You all go to a lot of these conferences, you speak at a lot of these conferences, but are there any areas that you're particularly concerned about that we don't have the focus on and we should be having the focus on? And again, so that people can be thinking ahead as to what that might be. And I'm not going to call on anybody specifically, but I'll let you kind of self-select here.
I'm happy to just start on very quickly, just my 2 cents. I talked about impact and I talked about purpose as well. We have, as large institutions, even small institutions, we're talking about sustainability, how do we measure impact, but I don't think there has been a clearly defined solution that is actually allowing us to measure that. So I think there is a niche opportunity right there in terms of actually helping us to think about that in more detail.
That's great.
For me, it's regulatory supervision. I think we're all moving very, very quickly. We have a very strong regulator who's extremely supportive of our sector, but I query whether their ability to supervise technology is keeping up with our ability to innovate.
That's a reg tech question. Yeah. Seema, did you have one?
Yeah, sorry, I'll be very, very quick. I was just going to talk about privacy again, to just say there is almost like a fundamental change from night to day now, where we have let personal and payment data get out of control, and I think there will be this thing over the next 5 years where we get control over it again, and and the user is more in control of their own data.
Okay, you get the last
one,
word.
One word, yeah. Just to say, I think, that's picking on that thought, but it's also about education, because I think people don't always understand, the issue about digital identity, their data and so on. So I think there's also education.
And with that, I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank Innovate Finance, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending. Thank you very much.